From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Hound by Fritz Leiber. David Lashley huddled, the skimpy blankets around him, and dully watched the cold light of morning seep through the window and stiffen in his room. He could not recall the exact nature of the terror against which he had fought his way to wakefulness, except that it had been in some way gigantic and had brought back to him the fear-ridden helplessness of childhood. It had lurked near him all night, and finally it had crouched over him and thrust down toward his face. The radiator whined dismally with the first push of steam from the basement, and he shivered in response. He thought that his shivering was an ironically humorous recognition of the fact that his room was never warm except when he was out of it. But there was more to it than that. The penetrating whine had touched something in his mind without being quite able to dislodge it into consciousness. The mounting rumble of city traffic, together with the hoarse panting of a locomotive in the railroad yards, mingled themselves with the nearer sound, intensifying its disturbing tug at hidden fears. For a few moments he lay inert, listening. There was an unpleasant stench too in the room, he noticed, but that was nothing to be surprised at. He had experienced more than once the strange olfactory illusions that are part of the aftermath of flu. Then he heard his mother moving about laboriously in the kitchen, and that strung him into action. "Have you another cold?" she asked, watching him anxiously as he hurriedly spooned in a boiled egg before its heat should be lost entirely in the chilly plate. "Are you sure?" she persisted. "I heard someone sniffling all night." "Perhaps father," he began. She shook her head. "No, he's all right. His side was giving him a lot of pain yesterday evening, but he slept quietly enough. That's why I thought it must be you, David. I got up twice to see, but—" Her voice became a little doleful. "I know you don't like me to come poking into your room at all hours." "That's not true," he contradicted. She looked so frail and little and worn, standing there in front of the stove with one of father's shapeless bathrobes hugged around her, so like a sick sparrow trying to appear chipper, that a futile irritation and indignation that he couldn't help her more welled up within him, choking his voice a little. "It's that I don't want you getting up all the time and missing your sleep. You have enough to do taking care of father all day long, and I've told you a dozen times that you mustn't make breakfast for me. You know the doctor says you need all the rest you can get." "Oh, I'm all right," she answered quickly, "but I was sure you'd caught another cold. All night long I kept hearing it, a sniffling and a snuffling." Coffee spilled over into the saucer as David set down the half-raised cup. His mother's words had reawakened the elusive memory, and now that it had come back he did not want to look it in the face. "It's late. I'll have to rush," he said. She accompanied him to the door, so accustomed to his hastiness that she saw in it nothing unusual. Her wan voice followed him down the dark apartment stair. "I hope a rat hasn't died in the walls. Did you notice the nasty smell?" And when he was out of the door, and had lost himself and his memories in the early morning rush of the city, tires singing on asphalt, cold engines coughing, then starting with a roar, heels clicking on the sidewalk, hurrying, trotting, converging on street car intersections and elevated stations, low heels, high heels, heels of stenographers bound downtown, and of war workers headed for the outlying factories, shouts of newsboys and glimpses of headlines, air blitz on battleship sunk, blackout expected here, driven back. But sitting in that stuffy solemnity of the streetcar, it was impossible to keep from thinking of it any longer. Besides, The stale medicinal smell of the yellow woodwork immediately brought back the memory of that other smell. David Lashley clenched his hands in his overcoat pockets and asked himself how it was possible for a grown man to be so suddenly overwhelmed by a fear from childhood. Yet in the same instant he knew with acute certainty that this was no childhood fear, this thing that had pursued him up the years, growing ever more vast and menacing until, like the demon wolf Fenris at Ragnarok, its gaping jaws scraped heaven and earth, seeking to open wider. This thing that had dogged his footsteps, sometimes so far behind that he forgot its existence, but now so close that he could feel its cold, sick breath on his neck. Werewolves? He had read up on such things at the library, fingering dusty books in uneasy fascination. But what he had read made them seem innocuous and without significance, dead superstitions, in comparison with this thing that was part and parcel of the great sprawling cities and chaotic peoples of the 20th century, so much apart that he, David Lashley, winced at the endlessly varying howls and growls of traffic and industry, sounds at once animal and mechanical, shrank back with a start from the sight of headlights at night. Those dazzling, unwinking eyes trembled uncontrollably if he heard the scuffling of rats in an alley or caught sight in the evenings of the shadowy forms of lean mongrel dogs looking for food in vacant lots. Sniffling and snuffling, his mother had said. What better words could you want to describe the inquisitive, persistent pryings of the beast that had crouched outside the bedroom door all night in his dreams, and then finally pushed through to plant its dirty paws on his chest? For a moment he saw, superimposed on the yellow ceiling and garish advertising placards of the streetcar, its malformed muzzle, the red eyes like thickly scum molten metal, the jaws slavered with thick black oil. Wildly he looked around at his fellow passengers, seeking to blot out that vision, but it seemed to have slipped down into all of them, infecting them, giving their features an ugly canine cast. The slack receding jaw of an otherwise pretty blonde, the narrow head and wide-set eyes of an unshaven mechanic returning from the night shift. He sought refuge in the open newspaper of the man sitting beside him, studying it intently without regard for the impression of rudeness he was creating. But there was a wolf in the cartoon, and he quickly turned away to stare through the dusty pane at the stores sliding by. Gradually the sense of oppressive menace lifted a little, but the cartoon had established another contact in his brain, the memory of a cartoon from the First World War. What the wolf or hound in that earlier cartoon had represented, war, famine, or the ruthlessness of the enemy, he could not say, but it had haunted his dreams for weeks, crouched in corners and waited for him at the head of the stairs. Later he had tried to explain to friends the horrors that may lie in the concrete symbolisms and personifications of a cartoon, if interpreted naively by a child, but had been unable to get his idea across. The conductor growled out the name of a downtown street, and once again he lost himself in the crowd, finding relief in the never-ceasing movement, the brushing of a shoulder against his own. But as the time clock emitted its delayed musical bong, and he turned to stick his card in the rack, the girl at the desk looked up and remarked, "Aren't you going to punch in for your dog, too?" "My dog?" "Well, it was there just a second ago. Came in right behind you, looking as if it owned you. I mean, you owned it." She giggled briefly through her nose. "One of Mrs. Montmorency's mastiffs comes to inspect conditions among the working class, I presume." He continued to stare at her blankly. "A joke," she explained patiently, and returned to her work. "I've got to get a grip on myself," he found himself muttering tritely, as the elevator lowered him noiselessly to the basement. He kept repeating it as he hurried to the locker room, left his coat and lunch, gave his hair a quick, careful brushing, hurried again through the still empty aisles, and slipped in behind the socks and handkerchiefs counter. "It's just nerves. I'm not crazy, but I've got to get a grip on myself." "Of course you're crazy. Don't you know that talking to yourself and not noticing anybody is the first symptom of insanity?" Gertrude Rees had stopped on her way over to neckties. Light brown hair, painstakingly waved and ordered, framed a serious, not too pretty face. "Sorry," he murmured. "I'm jittery." What else could you say, even to Gertrude? She grimaced sympathetically. Her hand slipped across the counter to squeeze his for a moment. But even as he watched her walk away, his hands automatically setting out the display boxes, the new question was furiously hammering in his brain. What else could you say? What words could you use to explain it? Above all, to whom would you tell it? A dozen names printed themselves in his mind, and were as quickly discarded. One remained, Tom Goodsell. He would tell Tom. Tonight, after the first aid class. Shoppers were already filtering into the basement. "He wears size 11, madam. Yes, we have some new patterns. These are silk and lisle." But their ever-increasing numbers gave him no sense of security. Crowding the aisles, they became shapes behind which something might hide. He was continually peering past them. A little child who wandered behind the counter and pushed at his knee gave him a sudden fright. Lunch came early for him. He arrived at the locker room in time to catch hold of Gertrude Reese as she retreated uncertainly from the dark doorway. "Dog!" she gasped. "Huge one. Gave me an awful start. Talk about jitters. Wonder where he could have come from. Watch out, he looks nasty." But David, impelled by sudden recklessness born of fear and shock, was already inside and switching on the light. "No dog in sight," he told her. "You're crazy. It must be here." Her face gingerly poked through the doorway, lengthened in surprise. "But I tell you, Oh, I guess I must have pushed out through the other door." He did not tell her that the other door was bolted. "I suppose a customer brought it in," she rattled on nervously. "Some of them can't seem to shop unless they've got a pair of Russian wolfhounds, though that kind usually keeps out of the bargain basement. I suppose we ought to find it before we eat lunch. It looked dangerous." But he hardly heard her. He had just noticed that his locker was open and his overcoat dragged down on the floor. The brown paper bag containing his lunch had been torn open and the contents rummaged through, as if an animal had been nosing at it. As he stooped, he saw that there were greasy black stains on the sandwiches, and a familiar stale stench rose to his nostrils. That night he found Tom Goodsell in a nervous, expansive mood. The latter had been called up and would start for camp in a week. As they sipped coffee in the empty little restaurants, Tom poured out a flood of talk about old times. David would have been able to listen better had not the uncertain, shadowy shapes outside the window been continually distracting his attention. Eventually he found an opportunity to turn the conversation down the channels which observed his mind. "The supernatural beings of a modern city?" Tom answered, seeming to find nothing out of the way in the question. "Sure. They'd be different from the ghosts of yesterday. Each culture creates its own ghosts. Look at the Middle Ages. Built cathedrals, and pretty soon there were little gray shapes gliding around at night to talk with the gargoyles. Same thing ought to happen to us with our skyscrapers and factories." He spoke eagerly with all his old poetic flair, as if he just sought meaning to discuss this very matter. He would talk about anything tonight. "I'll tell you how it works, Dave. We begin by denying all the old haunts and superstitions. Why shouldn't we? They belong to the area of cottage and castle. They can't take root in the new environment. Science goes materialistic, proving that there isn't anything in the universe except tiny bundles of energy. As if, for that matter, a tiny bundle of energy mightn't mean anything. But wait, that's just the beginning. We go on inventing and discovering and organizing. We cover the earth with huge structures. We pile them together in great shapes that make old Rome and Alexandria and Babylon seem almost toy towns by comparison. The new environment, you see, is forming." David stared at him with an incredulous fascination, profoundly disturbed. This was not at all what he had expected or hoped for. This almost telepathic prying into his most hidden fears. He had wanted to talk about these things, yes, but in a skeptical, reassuring way. Instead, Tom sounded almost serious. David started to speak, but Tom held up his finger for silence, aping the gesture of a schoolteacher. Meanwhile, what's happening inside each one of us? I'll tell you. All sorts of inhibited emotions are accumulating. Fear is accumulating. Horror is accumulating. A new kind of awe of the mysteries of the universe is accumulating. A psychological environment is forming along with a physical one. Wait, let me finish. Our culture becomes ripe for infection. From somewhere. It's just like a bacteriologist culture. I didn't intend the pun. When it gets to the right temperature and consistency for supporting a colony of germs. Similarly, our culture suddenly spawns a horde of demons. And like germs, they have a peculiar affinity for our culture. They're unique. They fit in. You wouldn't find the same kind any other time or place. How would you know when the infection had taken place? Say you're taking this pretty seriously, aren't you? Well, so am I, maybe. Why, they'd haunt us, terrorize us, try to rule us. Our fears would be their fodder. A parasite-host relationship. Supernatural symbiosis. Some of us, the sensitive ones, would notice them sooner than others. Some of us might see them without knowing what they are. Others might know about them without seeing them. Like me. What was that? I didn't catch your remark. Oh, about werewolves. Well, that's a pretty special question, but tonight I'd take a crack at anything. Yes, I think there'd be werewolves among our demons. But they wouldn't be much like the old ones. No nice clean fur, white teeth, and shining eyes. Oh no. Instead, you'd get some nasty hound that wouldn't surprise you if you saw it nosing at a garbage pail or crawling out from under a truck. Frighten and terrorize you, yes. But surprise, no. It would fit into the environment. Look as if it belonged in a city and smell the same. Because of the twisted emotions that would be its food. Your emotions and mine, a matter of diet. Tom Goodsell chuckled loudly and lit another cigarette. But David only stared at the scarred counter. He realized he couldn't tell Tom what had happened this morning, or this noon. Of course, Tom would immediately scoff and be skeptical, but that wouldn't get around the fact that Tom had already agreed. Agreed in partial jest, perhaps, but still agreed. And Tom himself confirmed this, when in a more serious, friendlier voice he said, "Oh, I know. I've talked a lot of rot tonight, but still, you know the way things are, there's something to it. At least, I can't express my feelings any other way." They shook hands at the corner, and David rode the surging streetcar home, through a city whose every bolt and stone seemed subtly infected, whose every noise carried shuddering overtones. His mother was waiting up for him, and after he had wearily argued with her about getting more rest and seen her off to bed, he lay sleepless himself all through the night, like a child in a strange house, listening to each tiny noise, and watching intently each changing shape taken by the shadows. That night nothing shouldered through the door or pressed its muzzle against the window pane. Yet he found that it cost him an effort to go down to the department store next morning, so conscious was he of the thing's presence in the faces and forms, the structures and machines around him. It was as if he were forcing himself into the heart of a monster. Detestation of the city grew within him. As yesterday, the crowded aisle seemed only hiding places, and he avoided the locker room. Gertrude Reeves remarked sympathetically on his fatigued look, and he took the opportunity to invite her out that evening. Of course, he told himself, while they sat watching the movie, she wasn't very close to him. None of the girls had been close to him. A not very competent young man, tied down to the task of supporting parents whose little reserve of money had long ago dribbled away. He had dated them for a while, talked to them, told them his beliefs and ambitions, and then one by one they had drifted off to marry other men. But that did not change the fact that he needed the wholesomeness Gertrude could give him. And as they walked along home through the chilly night, he found himself talking inconsequentially and laughing at his own jokes. Then, as they turned to one another in the shadowy vestibule, and she lifted her lips, he sensed her features altering queerly, lengthening. A funny sort of light here, he thought, as he took her in his arms. But the thin strip of fur on her collar grew matted and oily under his touch. Her fingers grew hard and sharp against his back. He felt her teeth pushing out against her lips, and then a sharp prickling sensation as of icy needles. Blindly he pushed away from her, then saw, and the sight stopped him dead, that she had not changed at all, or that whatever change had been was now gone. "What's the matter, dear?" he heard her ask startledly. "What happened? What's that you're mumbling? Changed, you say? What's changed? Infected with it? What do you mean? For heaven's sake, don't talk that way. You've done it to me, you say. Done what?" He felt her hand on his arm, a soft hand now. "No, you're not crazy. Don't think of such things. But you're neurotic and maybe a little batty. For heaven's sake, pull yourself together." "I don't know what's happened to me," he managed to say in his right voice again. Then, because he had to say something more, "My nerves all jumped, like someone had snapped them." He expected her to be angry, but she seemed only puzzledly sympathetic, as if she liked him but had become afraid of him, as if she sensed something wrong in him beyond her powers of understanding or repair. "Do take care of yourself," she said doubtfully. "We're all a little crazy now and then, I guess. My nerves get like wires, too. Good night." He watched her disappear up the stair. Then he turned and ran. At home, his mother was waiting up again close to the hall radiator to catch its dying warmth, the inevitable shapeless bathrobe wrapped about her. Because of a new thought that had come to the forefront of his brain, he had avoided her embrace, and after a few brief words hurried off toward his room. But she followed him down the hall. "You're not looking at all well, David," she told him anxiously, whispering because father might be asleep. "Are you sure you're not getting flu again? Don't you think you should see the doctor tomorrow?" Then she went on quickly to another subject, using that nervously apologetic tone with which he was so familiar. "I shouldn't bother with it, David, but you really must be more careful of the bedclothes. You laid something greasy on the coverlet, and there was big black stains." He was pushing open the bedroom door. Her words halted his hand only for an instant. How could you avoid the thing by going one place rather than another? "And one thing more," she added, as he switched on the light. "Will you try to get some cardboard tomorrow to black out the windows? They're out of it at the stores around here, and the radio says we should be ready." "Yes, I will. Good night, Mother." "Oh, and something else," she persisted, lingering uneasily just beyond the door. "That really must be a dead rat in the wall. That smell keeps coming in waves. I spoke to the real estate agent, but he hasn't done anything about it. I wish you'd speak to him." "Yes. Good night, Mother." He waited until he heard her door softly close. He lit a cigarette and slumped down on the bed to try and think as clearly as he could about something to which everyday ideas could not be applied. Question 1. And he realized with an ironic twinge that it sounded melodramatic enough for a dime novel. Was Gertrude Rees what might be called, for want of a better term, a werewolf? Answer: almost certainly not, in any ordinary sense of the word. What had momentarily come to her had been something he had communicated to her. It had happened because of his presence, and either his own shock had interrupted the transformation, or else Gertrude Rees had not proved a suitable vehicle of incarnation for the thing. Question 2. Might he not communicate the thing to some other person? Answer: yes. For a moment his thinking paused, as there swept before his mind's eye kaleidoscopic visions of the faces which might, without warning, begin to change in his presence. His mother, his father, Tom Goodsell, the prim-mouthed real estate agent, a customer at the store, a panhandler who would approach him on a rainy night. Question 3. Was there any escape from the thing? Answer: no. And yet there was one bare possibility: escape from the city. The city had bred the thing. Might it not be chained to the city? It hardly seemed to be a reasonable possibility. How could a supernatural entity be tied down to one locality? And yet he stepped quickly to the window, and after a moment's hesitation jerked it up. Sounds which had been temporarily blotted out by his thinking now poured past him in quadrupled volume, mixing together discordantly like instruments tuning up for some gigantic symphony. The racking surge of streetcar and elevated, the coughing of a locomotive in the yards, the hum of tires on asphalt, and the growl of engines, the mumbling of radio voices, the faint, mournful note of distant horns. But now they were no longer separate sounds. They all issued from one cavernous throat, a single moan, infinitely penetrating, infinitely menacing. He slammed down the window and put his hands to his ears. He switched out the lights and threw himself on the bed, burying his head in the pillows. Still the sound came through, and it was then he realized that ultimately, whether he wanted to or not, the thing would drive him from the city. The moment would come when the sound would begin to penetrate too deeply, to reverberate too unendurably in his ears. The sight of so many faces trembling on the brink of an almost unimaginable change would become too much for him, and he would leave whatever he was doing and go away. The moment came a little after 4 o'clock next afternoon. He could not say what sensation it was that, adding its straw weight to the rest, drove him to take the step. Perhaps it was a heaving moment and the rack of dresses 2 counters away. Perhaps it was the snout-like appearance momentarily taken by a crumpled piece of cloth. Whatever it was, he slipped from behind the counter without a word, leaving a customer to mutter indignantly and walk up the stair and out into the street, moving almost like a sleepwalker, yet constantly edging from side to side to avoid any direct contact with the crowd engulfing him. Once in the street, he took the first car that came by, never noting its number, and he found himself in an empty place in the corner of the front platform. With ominous slowness at first, then with increasing rapidity, the heart of the city was left behind. A great, gloomy bridge spanning an oily river was passing over, and the frowning cliffs of the buildings grew lower. Warehouses gave way to factories, factories to apartment buildings to dwellings, which were at first small and dirty, white, then large and mansion-like, but very much decayed, then new and monotonous in their uniformity. Peoples of different economic statuses and racial affiliation filed in and emptied out as the different strata of the city were passed through. Finally the vacant lots began to come, at first one by one, then in increasing numbers, until the houses were spaced out 2 or 3 to a block. "End of the line!" sang out the conductor. Without hesitation David swung down from the platform and walked in the same direction that the streetcar had been going. He did not hurry, he did not lag. He moved as an ottoman that had been wound up and set going and will not stop until it runs down. The sun was setting smokingly red in the west. He could not see it because of a tree-fringed rise ahead, but its last rays winked at him from the window panes of little houses blocks off to the right and left, as if flaming lights had been lit inside. As he moved they flashed on and off like signals. 2 blocks further on the sidewalk ended, and he turned down the center of a muddy lane. After passing a final house, the lane also came to an end, giving way to a narrow dirt path between the high weeds. The path led up a rise and through the fringe of trees. Emerging on the other side, he slowed his pace and finally stopped. So bewilderingly fantastic was the scene spread out before him. The sun had set, but high cloud banks reflected its light, giving a spectral glow to the landscape. Immediately before him stretched the equivalent of 2 or 3 empty blocks, but beyond that began a strange realm that seemed to have been plucked from another climate and another geological system, and sat down here outside the city. There were strange trees and shrubs, but most striking of all, great uneven blocks of reddish stone, which rose from the earth at unequal intervals and culminated in a massive central eminence 50 or 60 feet high. As he gazed, the light drained from the landscape, as if a cloak had been flipped over the earth, and in the sudden twilight there arose from somewhere in the region ahead a faint howling, mournful and sinister, but in no way allied to the other howling that had haunted him day and night. Once again he moved forward, but now impulsively, toward the source of the new sound. A small gate in a high wire fence pushed open, giving him access to the realm of rocks. he found himself following a gravel path between thick shrubs and trees. At first it seemed quite dark in contrast to the open land behind him, and with every step he took the hollow howling grew closer. Finally the path turned abruptly around a shoulder of rock, and he found himself at the sound's source. A ditch of rough stone about 8 feet wide and of similar depth separated him from a spare overgrown with short brownish vegetation and closely surrounded on the other 3 sides by precipitous rocky walls, in which were the dark mouths of 2 or 3 caves. In the center of the open spaces were gathered a half-dozen white-furred canine figures, their muzzles pointing toward the sky, giving voice to the mournful cry that had drawn him here. It was only when he felt the low iron fence against his knees and made out the neat little sign reading Arctic wolves that he realized where he must be, in the famous zoological gardens, which he had heard about but never visited, where the animals were kept as in nearly natural conditions as was feasible. Looking around he noted the outlines of 2 or 3 low inconspicuous buildings, and some distances away he could see the form of a uniformed guard, silhouetted against a patch of dark sky. Evidently he had come in after hours and through an auxiliary gate that should have been locked. Swinging round again he stared with casual curiosity at the wolves. The turn of events had the effect of making him feel stupid and bewildered, and for a long time he pondered dully as to why he should find these animals unalarming and even attractive. Perhaps it was because there was so much a part of the wild, so little of the city. That great brute there, for instance, the biggest of the lot, who had come forward to the edge of the ditch to stare back at him. He seemed an incarnation of primitive strength, his fur so creamy white. Well, perhaps not so white. It seemed darker than he had thought at first, streaked with black. Or was that due to the fading light? But at least his eyes were clear and clean, shining faintly like jewels in the gathering dark. But no, they weren't clean. The reddish gleam was thickening, scumming over, until they looked more like 2 tiny peepholes in the walls of a choked furnace. And why hadn't he noticed before that the creature was obviously malformed, and why should the other wolves draw away from it and snarl as if afraid? Then the brute licked its black tongue across its greasy jowls, and from its throat came a faint familiar growl that had in it nothing of the wild, and David Lashley knew that before him crouched the monster of his dreams, finally made flesh and blood. With a choked scream he turned and fled blindly down the gravel path that led between the thick shrubs to the little gate, fled in panic across empty blocks, stumbling over the uneven ground and twice falling. When he reached the fringe of trees he looked back to see a low lurching form emerge from the gate. Even at this distance he could tell that the eyes were those of no animal. It was dark in the trees, and dark in the lane beyond. Ahead the street lamps glowed, and there were lights in the houses. A pang of helpless terror gripped him when he saw there was no streetcar waiting, until he realized, and the realization was like the onset of insanity, that nothing whatever in the city promised him refuge. This, everything that lay ahead, was the thing's hunting ground. It was driving him toward its lair for the kill. Then he ran with the hopeless terror of a victim in this arena, of a rabbit loosed before greyhounds. Ran until his sides were walls of pain, and his grasping throat seemed aflame, and then still ran, over mud, dirt, and brick, and then on to the endless sidewalks, past the neat suburb dwellings, in which the uniformity seemed like monoliths lining some avenue of Egypt. The streets were almost empty, and those few people he passed stared at him as at a madman. Brighter lights came into view, a corner with 2 or 3 stores. There he paused to look back. For a moment he saw nothing. Then it emerged from the shadows a block behind him, loping unevenly with long strides that carried it forward with a rush, its matted fur shining oily under a street lamp. With a croaking sob he turned and ran on. The thing's howling seemed suddenly to increase 1,000-fold, becoming a pulsating wail, a screaming undulation that seemed to blanket the whole city with sound. And as that demonic screeching continued, the lights in the houses began to go out one by one. Then the streetlights vanished in a rush, and an approaching streetcar was blotted out, and he knew that the sound did not come altogether or directly from the thing. This was the long-predicted blackout. He ran on with arms outstretched, feeling rather than seeing the intersections as he approached them, misjudging his step at curbs, tripping and falling flat, picking himself up to stagger on, half stunned, his diaphragm contracted to a knot of pain that tied itself tighter and tighter. Breath rasped like a file in his throat. There seemed no light in the whole world, for the clouds had gathered thicker and thicker ever since sunset. No light except those twin points of dirty red in the blackness behind. A solid edge of darkness struck him down, inflicting pain on his shoulder and side. He scrambled up. Then a second solid obstacle in his path smashed him full in the face and chest. This time he did not rise. Dazed, tortured by exhaustion, motionless, he waited its approach. First a padding of footsteps, with a faint scraping of claws on cement, then a snuffling, then a sickening stench, then a glimpse of red eyes, and then the thing was upon him, its weight pinning him down, its jaws thrusting at his throat. Instinctively his head went up, and his forearm was clamped by teeth whose icy sharpness stung through the layers of cloth, while a foul oily fluid spattered his face. At that moment light flooded him, and he was aware of a malformed muzzle retreating into the blackness, and of weight lifted from him. Then silence and cessation of movement. Nothing at all except the light flooding down. As consciousness and sanity teetered in his brain, his eyes found the source of light, a glaring white disk only a few feet away. A flashlight, but nothing visible in the blankness behind it. For what seemed an eternity there was no change in the situation. Himself supine and exposed upon the ground in the unwavering circle of light. Then a voice from the darkness, the voice of a man paralyzed by supernatural fear. God, 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 over and over again. Each word dragged out with prodigious effort. An unfamiliar sensation stirred in David, a feeling almost of secure relief. "You saw it, then?" he heard issue from his own dry throat. "The hound? The wolf?" "Hound? Wolf?" The voice from behind the flashlight was hideously shaken. "It was nothing like that. It was—" Then the voice broke, became earthly once more. "Good grief, man! We must get you inside."